Well, thanks very much, everybody. It's a great pleasure and honour to be here. It was quite exciting when you were reading from the paper, because I think 3 of the 4 ideas you mentioned were actually in our publications that where we argued for exactly that. So what is the big society? You've doubtless heard numerous speeches, counter-invectives, and some very funny adverts by the Labour Party during the election, which I must say I really enjoyed. The big society, I think, is countering 2 problems. At its best, it's countering 2 problems. And they are, first of all, our broken society. And what's interesting is if you look at Mori and look at their polling indicators, over 70% of the British people believe our society is indeed broken, and the relationships between human beings and within neighbourhoods is felt by the overwhelming majority to be hugely atrophied and in danger. What's also interesting is a whole veneer of elite opinion doesn't believe that at all, or didn't believe that at all. Then the other dimension to the big society is our economy. Our economy became hugely centralised, in my view, hugely monopolised and concentrated. So progressively, millions and millions of people were progressively cut off from the benefits of ownership and the market across our society, becoming either dependent, let me be controversial, serfs on debt and on welfare that didn't change the situation but just kept them where they were. So in a way, the society sort of that we're at has 2 great dangers. One, it's not a society at all. It's the product of a radical individualism whereby nobody's connected to anybody else. And the resolution of that and all the problems that come from that is often through the state. And the state itself further individualises people with individual entitlements, meaning they don't have to work with each other, but they can just associate with a state that in some level guarantees them a minimum standard of life. What I think the big society does is it tackles both. It tackles both our economy, which I think has been underdeveloped and underarticulated, and it tackles our society. And it tackles them both by essentially having a completely new model of how we organise, our socio-economic life. And basically, for me, the first decisive move is association. Primary aim of the big society is to enable free association, to enable citizens to come together. And in coming together, they have a whole range of options that are profoundly transformative for them and for their communities in a way that hasn't been true before. Now, if citizens come together, everything else around them can change and can change differently. Let me give you an example. The state has primarily, since the Second World War, been viewed as an agent of redistribution. It delivers very small packets of money in welfare entitlements to people to maintain them where they are. What the state isn't is an agent of recapitalisation. And what the state isn't is a way to make a genuine transformative difference to people. What I think is so exciting about the current model is the state has now become an agent of recapitalisation. The state can now make a transformative difference to people's lives. Let me just give you one figure. In 1976, the bottom half of the population, the bottom 50%, owned 12% of the liquid wealth. That's the liquid capital to make a difference, to fund education, to start a business, to transform their lives. By 2003, that percentage had fallen to 1%. The bottom half of the population essentially had no capital to make a difference at all. So the view now is, well, even if you're left-wing, the state hasn't changed that. But what if we change the state? What if people and citizens can own the state? In our first report, we argued for the mass mutualisation of public services, whereby low-paid workers, who are often at the front line, who were progressively de-skilled, who couldn't in some sense own anything because they never had the income to facilitate that sort of purchase, actually became owners of their own businesses. And mass mutualisation of the public sector is now proceeding apace. On the other side, we have whole groups of people who've previously been individuated, who've been separated, who can now come together, and we also argue for the power of budgetary challenge, the idea that people who come together can bid to take over the services of the state that has previously been ineffective. Now, given that poverty tends to concentrate, though not necessarily, what actually happens if you look at certain areas, millions and millions, even over time, billions of pounds are spent on areas in high social need, but make very little difference. If those people themselves could come together, make a budgetary challenge to take over the budget spent on them and spend them differently, they could engender a whole series of transformative changes for them and their community. We know, for instance, that for every pound spent, 20% of that pound is lost through every bureaucratic level that it passes. We can create new networks, free of bureaucracy, at the bottom, that use the capital from the state. The amount of extra power leveraged through these new formations is incalculable. Now, this is where new technology comes in. This is where what you do is so decisive and so important, and it's a necessary, though not sufficient, precondition of what the big society wants to do. But let me just conclude this section by saying what the big society aims to do. It's not a cover for cuts. It's not a neo-right-wing ideology, as is evidenced by the fact that Ed Miliband and the Labour Party are now deciding to adopt it. That's a sign of winning the centre ground. The big society aims to bring people together and to economically empower them. That's its aim. Now, technology is vital to this because it's very clear since the Second World War that technology has had a disassociative effect, primarily through television. And Putnam in the States has done fairly exhaustive studies that I think are more or less buttressed by many other academics, that essentially technology has disassociated. In his book, Bowling Alone, he creates a society in which we essentially no longer work with one another. But what's very interesting is technology has shifted back. Technology has shifted back to being pro-social, to actually creating new networks, new forms of association, and new ways for human beings to interact. And what's interesting is the evidence shows exactly this. Let me just give you, if you forgive me, a quick lit review on association. Various studies have found, Tufekci from 2010, Zhao 2006, Wang and Wellman 2010, that internet users actually, with a high number of friends, begin to create new ties and new friends in the real world. And we've seen this across a whole range of studies. Internet users are more likely to be involved in voluntary activity. Internet users are more likely to use public space, access public space. And one of the studies talked about more likely to engage in serendipitous interaction with a stranger. Now, quite what that might be. I don't know, but I admit, find it hilarious. So, we now have this tool for the first time that can associate. How can this make a difference? Well, let me talk about something, go straight to the issue at hand. Let's talk about health. Let's talk about what the government's trying to do with health. Largely, I agree with the health reforms, because what they're doing is they're aligning medical treatment with budgets. And for a decade or two, people have always said one of the great drivers of costs in the health service is that the budgetary management and the medical management are at 90 degrees. So you double and triple bureaucracy. Fine. But that's not the real revolution. The real revolution is creating groups among both providers and users of healthcare to sort demand. Take, for instance, John Seddon's work. And in my view, John Seddon, who's a systems thinker, is absolutely right to say the greatest driver of cost for the state is flow. And if you understand flow, you understand the ways of minimizing demand. Now, what's flow? Flow is people coming to your public service saying, I have needs. Take, for instance, specialists in eye care. GPs largely are not specialists in eye care. When there's an eye care problem, they tend to panic, quite rightly, and refer immediately to a doctor. But what do we have out there in our health architecture? We have opticians. And we have opticians who have a huge level of expertise in between the GPs and the specialists, and yet we don't use them. So eye specialists have thousands and thousands of people queuing to see them on referrals, which leads to long waiting times, when if we used our service differently, we could understand that actually a lot of them didn't need to be referred to specialists, but could be dealt with very effectively by opticians. That's what I mean by understanding demand. Now, how does this relate to grouping activity? Well, if people can group together, they can understand their own needs far more effectively. Take, for instance, leukemia sufferers. Leukemia sufferers, because they're widely distributed but not concentrated across our country, by and large, one might suppose they never get excellent service. They never get service acutely tailored to them. What does budgetary personalisation mean? Budgetary personalisation means that people can group together. What does that mean? That means leukemia sufferers can group together and group purchase as a suffering unit a level of specialist healthcare hitherto unavailable to them. And then think of all the other types of long-term suffering that people might have, whether it's recovering from heart attack or anything else. If they can group together, they can create a budgetary line that can actually create expertise in provision. Moreover, as healthcare itself moves and has moved from acute management to chronic management, any medical professional will tell you that crucial to chronic management is the creation of an ability, a character to cope and to manage with what people suffer. And the thing is, people can't do this alone. So the obvious answer to 21st century healthcare is creating new networks in which people can look after one another, old age being the most obvious. And if we can create a society that looks after its old more, where we can create a culture and a network and a context in which we can keep old people out of hospital, out of long-term care, and plugged into sociality, all the indicators are it's a genuine win-win. It saves money, people are happier, and so on and so forth.